Everyone, thank you for coming. This is the AAEA track session that's co-sponsored by the international section, the experimental econ section, and the so we have good co-sponsorship. The topic of the session is going to be about pre-analysis plans. I initially, when I proposed this track session, I was going to present my own pre-analysis plan, but given COVID, we are not planning to do any field work in the near future. And so I thought, I honestly just haven't developed the pre-analysis plan because we're not going out into the field anytime soon. So what I figured I'd start with, or open the session with, is presenting research and, I guess, opinion, mainly opinion, from a recent article that Sarah and I have written called Ulysses Pact or Ulysses Raft, using pre-analysis plans in experimental and non-experimental research. And it's basically a kind of like a, I don't know, perspective or opinion piece on where Sarah and I think the value of pre-analysis plans are, what they're used for, how we can use them better, and where pre-analysis plans will be going in the future. Basically 15 to 20 years ago, there was this large debate in econ about RCTs versus traditional methods of impact evaluation and economic analysis. And there's this large debate about the value of RCTs. Over the last 5 to 6 years, we've gone through a similar period of time where pre-analysis plans have been proposed as the gold standard for organizing randomized controlled trial research. That the AEA journals will no longer accept experimental papers unless they have a pre-analysis plan. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the value of pre-analysis plans over the last 5 years. And so this is basically Sarah and me weighing in on where we think that value is or should be, and how we should be using these pre-analysis plans. So the title is a reference to Homer's The Odyssey, in a reference to two different stories about that Ulysses, which is or Ulysses in the Latin, Odysseus in the Greek. Ulysses' stories encounters that Ulysses has in the Odyssey. So the first is probably the most well known to most people, is Ulysses and his sailors are going to pass the island of the Sirens, and the Sirens sing this song which brings men or entices men to their doom. It basically makes them make decisions that will lead to their death. And their song is supposed to be extremely beautiful, and so Ulysses tells his sailors, "Bind me to the mast of the ship. And when we get close to the island of the Sirens, we're going, all of you who are not bound to the mast need to fill your ears with beeswax so that you cannot hear what the Sirens are singing, and you won't be tempted. I will get to listen to the Sirens' song, but because I'm bound, I won't be able to act on those incentives or those desires." And so Ulysses' Pact, and the reason why it's called Ulysses' Pact instead of Odysseus' Pact, is because it's been adopted by medical science and in law and economics. It's a legal term that refers to binding. So the idea is that a Ulysses Pact is similar to, or is basically a pre-analysis plan. The alternative to a Ulysses Pact, is a Ulysses Raft. So there's another story in the Odyssey about Ulysses. He's trapped on Calypso's island, and he's trying to find a way to get off. And so he doesn't have, he has very few tools at his disposal, but what he does is he uses what he has at his disposal, and out of the tools at hand fashions a raft. And from that raft is able to escape Calypso's island and go explore and basically eventually find his way home. And so that's in a metaphor for how we normally do, or how we have traditionally done economics, right? We use what we have at hand and figure out what the data says, and we go exploring in the data. So the idea is that these two metaphors, a Ulysses Pact, it's a pre-commitment device to a specific analysis plan, and a Ulysses Raft is the thing, you know, what we have historically done. We go exploring in the data and try and find the insights, try and find what the data says. And so over the last 5 years, there's been a big push, especially among experimentalists, to use Ulysses Pacts, to tie our hands or bind ourselves to the mast and basically not allow ourselves to go exploring in the data. And what Sarah and I have, you know, what our article basically argues is like, what is the value of this pact, and does the benefits of the pact outweigh the benefits of the raft? As I said, a Ulysses Pact is very common in law and medicine. If any of you have a living will is an example of a Ulysses Pact. It says, given my knowledge and ability now, I am committing to do this thing when I no longer have the ability to make those decisions. And so that idea of Ulysses Pact has been imported into economics as a pre-analysis plan that says, I'm committing now to make decisions in the future, even if they aren't the decisions I would make in the future. The argument for using Ulysses Pact or pre-analysis plan, it minimizes the probability of false discoveries. It reduces the researcher degree of freedom, right? You can't just go diving in data mining into the data later on. I'm bound or committed to the thing that I agreed to ahead of time. And there's the idea that this mirrors the way proper science is done. I hypothesize initially. I write out my hypothesis, I write out the tests that I'm going to do, and then I go to the data and actually test those hypotheses. The arguments for Ulysses Raft is that this is the way we've always done it. Like we've traditionally, you know, collected data and basically seen what the data shows. Ed Leamer has a book and an article from the early 80s about specification search, which says like this is a good thing. Like we need to go through and look at the data and search to see what the data tells us. The idea that we should bind ourselves prior is foolish, because this is not medical science, this is not physics. We're social scientists, and humans behave in different and interesting ways, and to do anything other than let the data speak for itself is foolishness. There's also the argument that these ideas really only apply to experimental work. And so the idea is that there's some argument that a Ulysses Pact is only useful for experimental research, which is now and will probably remain a minority of empirical work in economics. Experimental work has grown greatly over the last 15, 20 years, culminating, one might say, in the Duflo Banerjee and Kremer Nobel last year. So experimental work is much more common in economics, but still a minority of empirical work. And so is the idea of Ulysses Pact really only applicable to the minority of people who do experimental work? Right. So probably longer than its typical outline or intro, but because I'm not providing data, results, you know, methods, sort of typical presentation, I wanted to outline what I will be talking about over the next 10, 15 minutes, which is basically I'm going to provide a brief history of pre-analysis plans, both in the medical sciences and in economics. talk about the components of a pre-analysis plan, and then basically outline how they can be used both in experimental and non-experimental work. And at the end, I'll propose a crazy idea that Sarah and I have of a hybrid method, or a third way that may be useful to both experimentalists and non-experimentalists. So pre-analysis plans, which have become common over the last 5 to 8 years in economics, have their genesis in the medical sciences. Since 1997, in economics, a pre-analysis plan or registration, or pre-analysis plan and registration of that pre-analysis plan has been required by law in the US for drug trials. And the reason why the US government set this up was because there's strong incentives for drug companies to find positive results, right? Like, you spend millions of dollars developing a drug, now you have to do a clinical trial of it. The incentive of the researchers for that trial is to find that the drug works so that they can sell it to the public. So the US in 1997 required pre-analysis plans of all drug trials if the drug was eventually going to be approved by the FDA. That was in 1997. In 2004, the 12 best journals in medicine, basically the 12 journals that are part of the ICMJE, announced that public trial registration would be a prereq for any publication. So this is similar to what the AEA has done with its journals. If you want to submit or publish an experimental paper to the AEA journals, you now have to have a pre-registered trial, or you have to submit a pre-registration of that experimental trial. But in the medical field, this was even broader. It required public registration of all published papers. So not just experimental work, but any sort of paper that was going to be submitted and published in these journals required registration. And the stated goal, if you read the editor's statement of why they're doing this, it wasn't what the US government was trying to do in 1997. What the editors were trying to counter was the file drawer problem. This registration wasn't restricted to drug trials. It wasn't restricted to experimental work. It was all papers needed to have this pre-registration because the journal editors were trying to solve the file drawer problem, the idea that only significant results get published. And so by requiring all papers that are submitted to the journals to be pre-registered, you would then have a database that records the universe of all trials and all studies that are undertaken. And so you could look at what gets published and look at what does not get published, and basically see where, what's the publication bias in the medical field. And so the US government in their 1997 law and the editors of the journals in 2004 are trying to solve very different things, but use similar tools: pre-registration and pre-analysis plans and pre-registration. And you can see that the declaration, or the demand by the journal editors that all published papers be pre-registered had a huge impact on the number of registries. So clinicaltrials.gov is where most medical trials get registered. There are other ones, but the vast majority get registered at clinical trials. After the law, but before the editorial decision, so in those 1997 to 2004 period, about 2,000 registries were made every year. Since the editors made this decision, 22,000 registries are made every year. I mean, that's a gigantic leap in the number of registrations. And it's because by requiring this for published papers, every medical researcher is registering their work, regardless of whether it's an RCT clinical trial or observational work. And so, this decision by the editors made a huge difference, or it created a sea change in medical research. In social science, the traditional, sorry, drinking my coffee, it's still morning here in Arizona. In social science, the most commonly cited first studies that use a pre-analysis plan are this Casey et al. Paper about institutions in Benin, I believe, and Amy Finkelstein's paper about the organ health insurance experiment. Both of these were published in the QJE in 2012, and both of them are usually cited as the first examples of the use of a pre-analysis plan in social science. Each of them had slightly different reasons for using a pre-analysis plan. Finkelstein used it because she wanted to protect her and her co-authors against influence from the Oregon state government to prove that this experiment that they were doing was working. And so basically, Finkelstein et al. Used a pre-analysis plan to protect themselves against outside influence or implementer influence to force them to report favorable results. So Finkelstein et al. Are dealing with basically the same thing that the U.S. government was trying to counteract in the 1997 law. It's like they have, you have an incentive to report positive results. We're going to limit our ability to do that by writing a pre-analysis plan. In Casey, Glenister, and Miguel, their issue was more, how to measure useful or productive institutions. We don't really have a theory for that. You could measure them in a bunch of different ways. So we're going to lay out the ways we will measure this ahead of time in order to bind ourselves so that we don't go data mining and just come up with whatever we want. And so in the Casey et al. Paper, they actually show they could, if they tested these hypotheses or used these measures, they could get negative results. And if they chose a different set of results, they could get positive outcomes. So they show actually in the paper that we could have gotten whatever we wanted, but we bound ourselves, we tied our hands, and so you can believe the results that we got. So those papers were both published in the QJE in 2012. In that same year, the AEA established their RCT registry. So it allows for registration of lab and field experiments, but does not allow for registration of anything else. And if you want to publish a paper in an AEA journal that is experimental, you have to have it registered at someplace. Since the AEA established their registry in 2012, a number of other registries have been established for social science research. Their 3IE has a registry, but that's limited to impact evaluations that are taking place in low-income countries. There's also Open Science Foundation, which has a registry, and that is open to any sort of study. Anyone can register their reports or the pre-analysis plans at OSF. There is no limitation or constriction or restrictions on the type of studies that can be registered at OSF. So in the medical sciences, there's always been a very clear distinction between a pre-analysis plan and the public registration of those plans. A pre-analysis plan accomplishes or is designed to avoid or reduce p-hacking, reduce researchers' degrees of freedom. It's designed to limit the incentives of drug companies to find positive results for the drugs that they develop. That's the value and goals of a pre-analysis plan. And in a medical field, there's been a distinction made between what the pre-analysis plan accomplishes and what the registration of the plan accomplishes. The plan itself reduces the ability for researchers to p-hack or find false results. The registration of those plans solves the file drawer problem. And as I said, like with the laws in '97 and the editorial decisions in 2004, the statements about these decisions are very clear in the medical fields. These are two different things, and these are two different tools, plans and registration, and they accomplish two different things. One limits p-hacking, one resolves the file drawer problem, the idea that only significant results get published. In economics, if you read previous work about pre-analysis plans, Ben Olkins, Nicole Kaufman's, Berlig, Esther Duflo et al. There's a recent NBER working paper talking about pre-analysis plans. All of these papers really muddle this distinction. They talk about pre-analysis plans and registration as if they were the same thing. But Sarah and I, in our paper, what we outline is these are actually different things and they accomplish different things. And it's important, if we're going to use pre-analysis plans in economics, it's important for us to remember these distinctions and remember these differences, to not muddle the idea that analysis plans and registration accomplish the same thing. They do different things. So what is a pre-analysis plan? I imagine most of you on the call are aware of what a pre-analysis plan is, but we kind of want to outline what gets included in each in a pre-analysis plan. So in a basic pre-analysis plan, kind of the most generic, we would have a description of the data, you would have the hypotheses that you want to test, the outcome variables, the things that you're looking at, how you're going to construct the variables, and the models. So actually write out the models that you're going to test. That would be the basic pre-analysis plan. Some would argue that a pre-analysis plan really requires more comprehensive outlining of what you're going to do. And so a more comprehensive pre-analysis plan would include things like motivation, your theory or your theoretical model, your theory of change, how you're going to adjust for the multiple inference problem, how you're going to do data cleaning, how you deal with outliers, are you going to Windsorrize them, are you going to impute them, any correction for attrition, adjusting for contamination. What else? Any subgroup analysis, your power calculations. There's a recent work on exploratory analysis by Anderson Magruder and Fashamsa Labone, where they talk about generating fake data or bisecting the data and taking a small part out, testing your ideas on basically a pilot sample, and then using that to drive your full analysis. So a more comprehensive pre-analysis plan would entail outlining and detailing all of these additional elements. Okay. So kind of going back to how can we use these pre-analysis plans? So as I said, the plan itself is designed to prevent p-hacking. You form a Ulysses Pact that binds your hands as a researcher that says, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm only going to do these things. It limits a researcher's degree of freedoms. It limits their researcher's ability to explore the data. These are important, especially where there are strong incentives to cheat, such as in drug trials. When you've spent a lot of money to develop a drug, you want to basically bring that drug to the market. These are also important, binding your hands or forming the Ulysses Pact are also important when there's a lot of leeway for a researcher to discover something, right? This is the Casey paper. It's not clear how we should measure success of an institution, and so we could measure success wherever we want or however we want. Critics of pre-analysis plans, including Kaufman and Broder, have argued that these aren't really necessary for most economic research because economic theory limits what we might find. And as Broder shows, p-hacking doesn't seem to be a problem in experimental work. He looks through experimental and non-experimental work and doesn't find a lot of evidence for p-hacking in experiments. So in economics, Ulysses Pacts have been promoted as a way to limit p-hacking for experimental research, but there's not a lot of evidence that p-hacking is a problem in experimental research. Preventing p-hacking is the value of a pre-analysis plan. Solving the file drawer problem is the value of a registration, of registering these hypotheses. And so this is what actually Kaufman and Needley argue for in their 2015 paper, is we don't need pre-analysis plans, we need hypothesis registries. We need, like the editors of the medical science journals argued, we need a universe of all studies undertaken. And this is kind of what the registered reports in economic journals have been trying to get at. Let's register these things ahead of time so we know what works and what doesn't. So we know we're not just publishing the significant results. And a Ulysses Pact in and of itself doesn't solve this problem. The registries, the public registries solve this problem, not the Ulysses Pacts. And so even if you're not doing a RCT or writing a Ulysses Pact, it may be valuable to solve the file drawer problem by registering the work that you're doing. Historically in economics, the story of pre-analysis plans in economics has been that they started with these RCTs, the Casey et al. And the Finkelstein et al. Paper, which were both published in 2012 in the QJE. But actually the first published paper in Econ that uses a pre-analysis plan was by Newmark in 2001, fully 11 years before Casey and Finkelstein. It's published in Industrial Relations. And what he did was he wanted to test the impact of a minimum wage law on employment. And so he filed a pre-analysis plan ahead of the public release of government data. He filed the pre-analysis plan with the editors of the journal. And then when the data was released, then he implemented that pre-analysis plan. So actually, even though pre-analysis plans are viewed as primarily something for RCTs and Econ, the very first example of a pre-analysis plan in Econ was not an RCT, but was using observational or administrative data. I think the takeaway that I want everyone to get from my presentation today is that economics has muddled the point. It's muddled the idea that pre-analysis plans and registration of them are the same thing. They accomplish the same ideas, and that pre-analysis plans are really only valuable for experimental work. And I think David Newmark's research, he has a new paper that just came out in the IZA working papers, doing the same thing. The fact that the first pre-analysis plan was not an experimental work demonstrates that we can use pre-analysis plans for something more than just RCTs, and that registration of our plans is valuable because they help solve this file drawer problem. The plans can also be used and have been used for replication. So Andrew Chang, who's at the US Fed, has a whole bunch of studies in which he files these pre-analysis plans to guide his replication studies. They're not using new data, they're not using RCT data, but he basically said, I'm going to try and replicate these papers, and so I'm going to file the analysis plan, usually at OSF. It says how I'm going to replicate these papers, then I go about doing it. They're also really useful for teaching, and this is something that Sarah and I have both found. Grad students, both of us when we were grad students, but also our work with grad students reveals that grad students often don't know what they want to do or what they need to do. And so making a pre-analysis plan part of the prospectus for a dissertation can be really helpful. I've also found it helpful in my observational research to help guide and basically communicate to students what they should be doing. And so even if those analysis plans are never, they should be published, they should be registered, but even if you aren't going to register them, they can still be a useful teaching tool to basically say, this is how we do economic science. All right, so wrapping up, a pre-analysis plan, it's a Ulysses Pact. The goal of the analysis plan is to bind the researcher to limit its p-hacking. registration of the plan helps solve the file drawer problem. But these are two different things. The plan and the registration are distinct things and they solve distinct problems. In economics, this has kind of been muddled. And in economics, the use of pre-analysis plans has really been focused on RCTs. This is kind of, we pose this in juxtaposition to a Ulysses raft, which basically allows researchers to explore messy social science data. There's value in that. Ed Leamer writes very eloquently about the value of digging in and letting the data speak for itself. But we don't, we don't think that these two ideas, the Pact and the raft, should be exclusive. And so what we want to propose as an idea to be discussed and thought about and debated is the idea of a Pact raft. And so a Pact raft is basically a portable raft. You can fold it up like a backpack, you can unpack it like a raft. This was invented back in the mid-1800s for use in exploring the northern Canada, the Canadian Arctic. And the idea of a Pact raft would be to write out a very basic pre-analysis plan that guides your research, that says, these are the things I'm going to test, this is the data I'm going to use, and these are the models I'm thinking of implementing, and register that. Basically, we think it's important as a discipline to encourage telling readers at what point in the research process and for what reasons a particular model emerged. So we think the idea of a Pact raft is basically, whether you're doing experimental work or non-experimental work, you should sit down ahead of time, draw up a research plan, and then post it on OSF or archive. Post it publicly somewhere so that we have a registration of all the studies that have been undertaken in economics. And it doesn't need to necessarily bind you like a RCT pre-analysis plan does, but it should provide an outline for what you plan to do, so that in the research paper, when you finally publish it, you say to the reader, this is what I plan to do, and this is how I deviated. And so the reader knows what you did and what you didn't do. And we think that's an important part of doing economic research. The idea of the Pact raft is this hybrid between a full raft where you just explore and do kind of data mine, and a Pact in which you bind yourself to doing only the things that you pre-specify. So if you read the paper, Sarah and I promote or make a number of recommendations that we should, as the field of agricultural and applied economics, should promote this idea that the AJE should require registration like the AEA does. And yeah, I'm way over time. I apologize for that. So because I ran over time, I'm going to just hand it off immediately to Sarah to present her pre-analysis plan for an experimental study. And if we have time at the end, we can come back to comments on my paper.
All right, great, thanks, Jeff. I think to share my screen yet, there you go, thank you. Share my screen real quick. All right, hopefully you all can hear me okay. So today I'm presenting a pre-analysis plan. Like Jeff, the original intentions of this session got changed by COVID. So originally we were gonna present a pre-analysis plan for some work we were doing in Kenya. That work is no longer happening. So I apologize to those of you in the Africa section that were hoping for an application in Africa. But today I'm presenting a paper or a pre-analysis plan on traditional and distance learning training programs to develop female community animal health workers in Nepal. This is joint work with Nick Magnan at University of Georgia, Connor Mullally at University of Florida, and Shruti Sharma, who is a PhD student at University of Georgia. Oops, sorry, what did I do? Okay, So this research project was motivated by what I'll call a missing market in rural Nepal. The market being for community animal health workers who can provide inputs and technical, help when your livestock get sick or need something. So we had been, at least some of us had been working with Heifer International in Nepal for several years, and they, together with the government of Nepal, had realized that it was very difficult to recruit women in particular to go for trainings, despite the opportunity for income generation. So we started puzzling over why that might be. The typical training for a community animal health worker is pretty intense. It typically involves 35 consecutive days away from your home at a training center. And you can see a typical training center in these pictures. That makes it potentially very difficult for women to participate, especially given responsibilities at home or on their farms. In particular, women with small children, which you can see in that picture on the right. In Nepal, male migration is quite high, which further constrains women to the home. And then women may also be unable to complete the training simply due to family concerns about women's behavior or safety away from the home for such an extended period of time. So with that in mind, we partnered with Heifer International Nepal in collaboration with the government of Nepal's Ministry of Livestock Development and USAID's Feed the Future Livestock Systems Innovation Lab to train up to 150 community animal health workers. And I'm going to call those CAWs in Nepal. So the training comes in two forms. Typically, there's this traditional training program that I just described. And then the innovation that we offered in this project was to provide an alternative form of training, what we'll call distance learning. So distance learning requires that trainees do leave their village and they stay at a training center with other trainees, but only for about a 5-day orientation, during which they meet their instructors, learn how to use tablets, they're told how they'll be monitored by training center personnel, and then they return back to their villages to complete about 30 days of a digitized version of the same curriculum. After those 30 days at home, they return to the training center for 10 more days to conduct practical hands-on exercises as well as sit for their final exams. So we have these, what we're comparing here is the same training, same level of certification, qualification, same curriculum, but really just two different modes of training. In that, our research questions are as follows. We have basically 3 overall research questions. Question number 1, which is our primary research question, what is the impact of any type of CAW training on the nominee's welfare, gender attitudes, and aspirations? Second, we want to think about whether this has any impacts in the household overall. So what's the impact of this training on gender attitudes and aspirations of other household members? And I'll talk about who I'm talking about in a little bit. So that's a secondary research question. And then third, is distance learning a viable method for training female CAWs? So making that comparison between the traditional training and the distance learning training. All right, so before I dive into our research design, I want to kind of point out just where we're at in the process. So this pre-analysis plan was written after the completion of both courses. So we already know, and we'll report here to you all, the enrollment and completion rates. It was written after multiple focus group discussions in the middle, near the end, and even after completion of training, because we wanted to see and monitor kind of how it was going. And then, but it was written before any quantitative inline data was collected. And our intention is to register it ASAP. So we're hoping to get some feedback today, and then we'll have this thing finalized. Okay, so our research design, we have a 2-stage randomization. So Heifer Nepal had been working with about 100 cooperatives in this area. Each of those cooperatives nominated maybe 2, maybe 4 nominees for their cooperative for the training program. We randomly assigned each cooperative to a mode of training, so either distance learning or traditional training. Cooperatives were stratified based on cooperative level variables. And then our second level randomization assigned nominees within a cooperative to the training type that the cooperative was assigned to, or a control. So within each cooperative, we have a treated nominee and a control nominee. Yeah. And so I'm not going to show them today, but our balance tables are included in the pre-analysis plan, and they look pretty good. Okay, so as I mentioned, we already know recruitment and completion by training format. This is actually one of our initial hypotheses. So to some extent, we're presenting evidence on that initial hypotheses in our pre-analysis plan. That hypothesis being that it may be easier to recruit women into distance learning training than traditional training. And we show that that's indeed the case. So in this table, the first 3 columns are treatment group, the last 3 columns are control group, and then I have a row for distance learning and a row for traditional training. So for each treatment and control, there's a column for nominated, and you can see that you know, roughly half are treatment, half are control, and half of the co-ops are distance learning and half are traditional training. So we have a relatively even split. In the treatment group, everyone that was nominated was recruited, that's by definition. In the control group, by definition, right, no one was recruited. And then that third column for both treatment and control, the completed column is really where all the action is. So what you see there is in the third column, we have about a little over 50% recruitment rates, or like in terms of people who actually sign up and complete the treatment, about 50% in distance learning and closer to 30% in the traditional training. So you can see that you know, completion rates are much higher for distance learning, which is what we expected. Now, when we think about our analysis, those differences are going to become really important as we think about interpreting our treatment effects, right? Because we have differential recruitment, and if we see differences in impacts, they could be related to so both quality differences in the type of training, as well as selection differences in the type of person who's willing to do the distance learning versus the traditional training. And in the case of ITT, those different recruitment rates as well. So we want to be able to unpack those, and that's one of the challenges that we're thinking through is like, what's the best way to unpack, you know, the quality differences between the training and the selection differences between who signs up. So we're definitely looking for your feedback on that. The last thing I want to point out in this table is that last column, the completed column for the control group. We do have a little bit of non-compliance there. So a few of our control group nominees managed to sign up and enroll and complete the distance learning and the traditional training programs. All right, so our inline data collection plan, we've completed baseline, nominees have been trained, and now we're set to do inline data collection. Yeah, about a year after training programs were completed. So we have 2 inline data collection efforts planned. We've converted our first inline data collection entirely to phone-based surveys, which we plan to implement basically immediately. And we'll break the original kind of longer survey into multiple phone-based surveys. And then we're still hoping, depending on feasibility, to implement another in-person survey sometime in 2021. At each inline, we plan to interview 3 different respondents for each household. So we'll obviously interview the female candidate, and then we also plan to interview a male relative and a female relative in order to unpack our second research question, which is, how do these things change in the household among other relatives? So mostly what we're looking for there is a husband or a father and a mother-in-law or a mother, depending on who's living in her household. And then this last table kind of illustrates how we plan to break this up. So really, the first phone survey we would be doing is like income and savings and some livestock management stuff. The second survey, just with that candidate. Second survey would look at women's empowerment and gender attitudes and aspirations, as well as kind of household allocation of chore responsibilities. That would be for the candidate. A third survey over here would be just for people who actually got trained. We'll have more specific questions about kind of their CA businesses. And then we'll do a fourth survey with the male relative, where we ask about gender attitudes and aspirations and how much they contribute to chores. And the same thing separately for a female relative. All right, so with a pre-analysis plan, one of the most important and useful but also painful parts is deciding on your primary outcomes. And we were working on this kind of simultaneously as we were developing our survey. So one thing we do, which has been quite helpful, is to kind of lay out exactly which questions will be analyzed for what particular outcomes. So this first primary research question, what's the impact of CA training on basically nominee welfare? We have 5 sets of primary outcomes: income, saving, empowerment, gender attitudes, and aspirations. Each of these overall categories consists of multiple indicators. So like in the case of income, we'll sum up total income as kind of a general outcome. In other variables like empowerment or attitudes, we'll create an inverse covariance weighted standardized index following the Anderson approach. And actually some co-authors and I just developed a Stata code for that. So if anybody wants that code, a Stata command, we can do that quite nicely. Just email me. And then we'll, yeah, so that's basically what we're doing there. So behind the scenes of these 5 bullet points, there's quite a large number of variables that are linked directly to our survey that feed into this. But obviously I don't have time to talk about all of those outcomes today. I should mention, if anyone wants to see our pre-analysis plan, we're happy to share it with you. Okay, so our second research question, what's the impact of CA training on gender attitudes and aspirations? So we have these 2 different secondary outcomes, the attitudes. And when I say aspirations for these other household members, we're talking about aspirations for the woman candidate and for her children. So not necessarily, the husband's aspirations for himself, but rather his aspirations for the woman candidate. Okay, so research questions 1 and 2, we're going to analyze in the same way. So I'll talk about our strategy for both of those questions, and then I'll come back to our third research question. So our main plan, I would say probably our main estimate that we're interested in is the local average treatment effect, which estimates the impact of becoming a CA on nominees who only become a CA when invited. So basically the compliers. In our case, 50% of DLs take up the treatment, about 30% of TT take up the treatment. Only a handful of controls manage to take up the treatment despite not being invited. So given those, the late local average treatment effect will be a very close approximation to the treatment on the treated effect, which really answers this question of what is the impact of becoming a CA among those who became CAs. And we think this is arguably the most policy relevant treatment effect of interest. So that's the one we're, I think, most interested in. So how do we do that? Fairly straightforward in our case. This first stage regression down here, we have this randomized invitation to become a CA. So we use that as our instrument in our first stage. We have this predicted CA hat. Then in our second stage regression, we'll control for demeaned outcome at baseline. So in that sense, we're running ANCOVA. S is a stratification bin dummy. We'll throw in some controls. We plan to select our control variables using PDS lasso. Yeah, and then we have obviously the error terms. So when we estimate this, so we did do some power calculations where we're accounting for the fact that we're estimating that first stage regression. And our best power calculations that we can do, at least with the variables that we do have at baseline, is an minimum detectable effect of about 0.5 to 0.6 standard deviations. This is admittedly larger than we'd like to see. However, we also expect really large impacts given the intensity of the training. So it's hard to say whether that's good or bad. It's not quite as good as we'd like to see, but again, we expect big impacts in this case. So although late is arguably the more policy relevant estimate, we know and recognize that IB estimators may perform poorly in small samples. So with that in mind, we'll also estimate ITT, or intent to treat effects, which captures the impact of being invited, or like the impact of inviting a woman as a viable candidate, of inviting a woman to become a CA, basically. In our case, recruitment is not super high, so ITT will be low, even if it's very impactful for those who are actually, complete the training. So we plan to estimate both. I think ITT is a more standard thing to estimate in an RCT. In our case, again, I think late is probably more policy relevant. I'll just say quite candidly, we debated a lot internally about whether we want to present both, and we're somewhat conflicted, so we appreciate your feedback there. The power calculations without the late look a lot better, but again, you have to weigh that against the fact that recruitment rates are somewhat low. So those estimates, we really need bigger impacts to get to that 0.25 to 0.3 standard deviation impact. All right, so our third research question, our third and final research question, is looking at distance learning specifically. Is it a viable method for training female community animal health workers? So we have a list of secondary outcomes here, but mostly we're focused on things that are very directly related to CA training: knowledge, livestock management, recruitment and completion of the course, breadth and depth of service provision, whether you can do these activities independently and competently, are you successful? And then of course, what's your income as a community animal health worker, as well as your investment in the business. This gets a lot more complicated in terms of the empirical approach. So first of all, some outcomes are only observed for those who have completed the trainings, like exam scores and indicators of clients, like how many clients did you serve. So there's two different ways we'll treat those outcomes. Some of them, it's pretty straightforward to impute missing values as zeros. In those cases, we can estimate late and ITT just the same as we did before. For other outcomes like exam scores, you can't really impute a zero for missing, so we'll have to explore different methods. We're still talking about what that'll look like, so we appreciate feedback there too, but probably some kind of sample selection models like a Heckman model. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time going into the details of late or ITT here, but as I said, for those values where we impute zeros, we can estimate late or ITT. So this is the late approach. The main difference is that now I have 2 instruments. In the first stage, the invitation to become traditional training versus the invitation to become a distance learning recruit. So 2 other differences here. So one is that we can cluster our we have to cluster our standard errors at the cooperative level for these regressions because treatment, the type of treatment, the type of training was assigned at the cooperative level. The second thing that I want to mention, because we'd really love feedback on it, is whether we want to pre-specify, potentially we could assess whether distance learning results in lower quality cause using one-sided non-inferiority test. So this idea that we're not really interested in knowing whether the impacts of the 2 training programs are the same, like beta 1 equals beta 2. We're more interested from a policy perspective in saying, you know, distance learning is no worse than traditional training. If that was what we wanted to say, we could pre-specify one of these non-inferiority tests. So that's something we're contemplating doing, but hesitant to pre-commit to. This is the ITT, and that's mostly just the same, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is in terms of comparing, you know, whether distance learning is a viable alternative. So I mentioned this a little bit when I was talking about completion rates. Differences in, you know, our impacts by training system, particularly the late impacts, could emerge because of differences in the type of candidate selecting into each system or because of differences in the systems themselves, like the quality of the program. To unpack this, I mean, the first thing we can do is just present differences in observed characteristics for individuals completing each type of training. We've already looked at that, and they don't look a lot different based on observables, so that's maybe surprising. But the second thing we can do is explore different approaches to estimating counterfactual outcomes under these alternative training systems for each type of training or group of trainees. So the idea would be that we'd be holding training characteristics fixed while estimating the impact of a change in the training system, which allows us to isolate the importance of that change in the training system in generating the late results. So we think that's really important. It gets us, you know, much further away from our standard RCT identification strategy, but we think it's really important in this case. So we're exploring lots of alternative approaches. This is definitely an area where we're interested in feedback and ideas. So I list some of our options there, but basically we're not really sure what the best approach is going to be. So we're welcoming ideas. I think that's the end. So I don't know if I have any time for questions. It's 12 o'clock, so maybe we could just move on to Jake. Oops.
Sounds good.
Sure. Go ahead.
And then we can hold all questions to the very end.
Yeah. And I think I can get through this relatively quickly. Can everybody see my screen? Okay. Okay. You can hear me as well. Thanks for coming to this virtual talk. Jake Ricker-Gilbert from Purdue, along with Tim Rendall from Purdue and Patrick Kittiam from the Kenya Ag and Livestock Research Organization. We're going to talk about building last mile supply chains with youth input resellers in Kenya. Just real quick, this work's funded by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Processing and Post-Harvest Handling at Purdue and the LASER project, also USAID funded. And this work, I think it'll be a nice comparison or contrast to Sarah's in that it's a more early stage PAP. We were supposed to get funding, add-on funding for this project in April, but because of, you know, everything that's going on, we found out that we would get the extra funding to do this within the last month. So the PAP we could think of as a first draft, and any suggestions and feedback and more details for moving forward are appreciated, and I'm happy to share the PAP with you all. So our plan, our pre-analysis plan here is to test a model to address two key challenges to development in sub-Saharan Africa, both quite well-known and well-understood challenges. The first is youth unemployment, and the second is limited access to inputs among smallholder farmers, particularly on the last mile of the input supply chain. And the genesis for this came out of some previous projects we've been working on here at Purdue, trying to promote inputs, post-harvest inputs, and realizing that when we try to train and build the supply chain for inputs, the last mile, getting it to the farmer in the rural area when and where they need it, is a big challenge. So the first challenge, population is growing in some countries of sub-Saharan Africa at more than 3% a year. In many countries, for example, Kenya, where we're going to work, land's often divided amongst many children, causes farm sizes to shrink against a fixed land base, making agricultural less viable. There's evidence to suggest in many places of rural sub-Saharan Africa that youth are abandoning agriculture in search of other forms of employment or migrating. And the Kenyan government estimates that in 2019, 39% of rural youth were estimated to be unemployed, which is equal to almost 14 million people. So it is a big problem. The second problem is, of course, this lack of access to ag inputs. If we define access as the ability of farmers to purchase or acquire ag inputs when and where they need them in a timely fashion. It's also related to high costs that make it unprofitable for farmers to use inputs like inorganic fertilizer and improved seeds. This paper by Minton tracked households in Ethiopia along a 35-kilometer stretch of rural road. And it's really interesting. They found that within the last 10 miles, the most rural 10 kilometers of the road, the cost doubled between there and the international port, which was more than 1,000 kilometers away. So, big increases in markup on that last mile, last 10 kilometers. So their conclusion is that the last mile needs focus in development in order to increase inputs. And, as we all know, low ag input use and late application of inputs, not having access to, for example, fertilizer in a timely fashion, results in lower yields. This is just an example of the pick from the PICS project, the hermetic bag project that Purdue's been working on and I've been involved with. Asking people if they knew about the PICS bag, why they didn't buy it. This is from Uganda. The bags first became available there in 2015. People were trained in that year, and then we went back a year later to see what happened. And those people that knew about it but didn't buy, the most popular reason, over 60%, was that they said they didn't know where to buy it, so they didn't have timely access to it. And then the second reason was the price. So with that in mind, we plan to help reduce these two problems of youth unemployment and access to inputs on the last mile by training rural youth in Eastern Kenya to become resellers and ag input suppliers. The project's working with local agro dealers who are part of a network that I'll talk about in a second. We'll train agro dealers, on business and the project. We're also going to train youth on sales, accounting, entrepreneurship, and gender, using training material that's been created by Calro and other NGOs. In addition to training, the youth will receive initial seed capital that I'll talk about, and they'll start selling post-harvest inputs, including, they'll be trained, including tarps for drying grain off the ground, low-cost moisture meters that cost about $2.50, and the PICS hermetic bags, which cost about $2.50 as well for 100 or a 90 kg bag in Kenya. In addition, the youth will provide support services like filling bags for people, tying and transporting bags, and doing moisture testing so people can know if their grain is dry enough for storage. Ideally, eventually, if they're successful, they can expand into other inputs like fertilizer, seed, even pesticides. But to maintain the scope of the project, we're going to start with post-harvest inputs at first. So the design, you can think of it as a randomized rollout. We're going to work with 300 youth and work through 30 agro dealers. So the design plan is for 10 youth per agro dealers. The agro dealers are part of Bell Industries Network. They're the ones who make the PICS bags in Kenya. They sell tarps and moisture meters as well. We have an existing relationship with them. So the agro dealers, as I said, will select 10 or more youth who they would trust to work with. And that's important since they're going to be, extending credit and working with them. So it'll be an individual level randomization because within the agro dealers, 5 youth will be randomly trained in year 1, and then 5 will be trained in year 2. Per the agreement with USAID, we need to offer some training to the control group as well, and we'll survey them all in each year. So the way we're planning to design it is that the youth will put up somewhere between 10 and 20% of the collateral to receive about a $50 input package of the PICS bags, moisture meters, tarps to sell to farmers and rural traders in rural areas. The credit will be extended for 1 month. They can then sell for a markup to people who want to buy, and they can borrow more if they pay it back to the agro dealers within a month. And we're still working out the details of the collateral arrangement with the agro dealers. But these are people who've worked with Bell, and they should be incentivized to, want to sell more, and if they trust these youth to work with them and hopefully extend them credit. So the key outcomes measured in the study will be value of sales, net income, number of consumers reach, consumption expenditure, and the ability of the people trained in year 1 and receiving capital in year 1 to continue and potentially build their business in year 2 after they're no longer receiving direct support from the project, but the relationship with the agro dealers may continue. We'll measure these differences between the treatment and control youths in year 1 and 2. We'll verify outcomes by having youth keep a transaction books to record sales, and we'll follow up with the agro dealers to verify their sales numbers. So the research questions presented as testable hypotheses are: the first question is, can providing this intervention, the training and the access to credit for the youth, the rural youth, reduce their constraints to employment and allow them to engage in this business and improve their income and well-being in the year that they participate. The second is, are there longer-term sustainable benefits to participating in year 1? Can we observe those benefits in year 2? And the third is to try to understand a bit about personal levels of ability, measured as grit and aspirations. Can the people who at baseline have higher levels of both of those indicators be more successful in the program and obtain higher income and well-being through it? So the survey location, Eastern Kenya, the counties, the rural areas, Machakos, Makueni, and Kitui counties. They're relatively close to Nairobi, especially Machakos. So relatively good market access and high population density, which means there's potential for youth to find people to sell inputs to rather than searching around forever, which would, for a customer, which would reduce the profitability of being a reseller. It's also drought prone. So there's one main maize season, making post-harvest practices and longer term storage important. So we're hypothesizing that that'll mean, more demand from farmers and small scale traders. And there is a large agro dealer network that works with Bell Industries. For example, those agro dealers in that area have sold over 200,000 PICS bags in 2020. But when you think about the population for those areas, there's room for a lot more sales. So the market is potentially there, and we'll see if these youth can go out and get it. So I'll talk about the timeline, but the baseline data will be collected before training starts. The beginning of the first season, we'll collect demographic information from the youth, standard demographics, including access to land, their income generating activities at baseline, what they've been doing in the past year, as well as a measure of grit and aspirations. Then we'll have follow-up surveys at the ends of year 1 and year 2, which will focus on collecting the outcome variables. We'll try to make this short and focused to avoid fatigue. And for people that we can't find in person at follow-up, we'll follow up with mobile phone to try to minimize attrition. The estimation strategy. So we're gonna focus on the intention to treat effect, being offered the opportunity to participate in this training and credit intervention. for youth I who works for agro dealer J, where Y are outcomes of interest, sales, income, etc. T is our treatment variable. G is our vector that measures grit and aspirations following the recent literature on the topic. We'll create a scale for each of those and include those as a regressor in the model. We'll have a vector of youth demographics that are unbalanced at baseline. We'll include agro dealer fixed effects and baseline, the baseline outcomes as well. So an ANCOVA specification and an individual error assumed to be uncorrelated with the covariates based on our design, and we'll cluster the standard errors at the agro dealer level. And then the first hypothesis about whether or not the intervention improves rural youth income in year 1 is tested through the estimate of beta 1 hat. Second, we'll look at those a little bit longer term effects, the year 2 effects, where the variables y, t, g, x, and a are the same as in equation 1, with alphas as parameters to estimate and mu as the individual error. And alpha 1 here tests hypothesis 2 that if participating in the intervention in year 1 has a longer term benefit in year 2 for those treated households, that they continue selling inputs and increasing their income. And then finally, we'll estimate if those who have higher grit and or aspirations gain more from the intervention. That's obtained through interacting the measure of grit and aspirations with the treatment variable. So, sorry, that should be delta 1 at the bottom. Test hypothesis 3, if those youth who have higher grit and aspirations get more from the program and obtain higher well-being in year 1 and year 2 from participating in the intervention in year 1. We'll also look at the local average treatment effects as well for those who accept the participation offer and actually complete the training and do start selling inputs. We'll also do some exploratory heterogeneity analysis to look at heterogeneous treatment effects by interacting the treatment variables with our X's in equation 1 to see how things like gender and education affect people's success as input resellers. And then the timeline, which is of course subject to change. As I mentioned, we're focused in Eastern Kenya. The main growing season is basically now, August to September, with harvest in December through February, with a little bit of variation in timing depending on the rains and what varieties of maize are being grown. So farmers should be in the field now, and had the timeline gone according to plan, we would have been in the field now. But of course, we're delayed. On the bright side, it's giving us more time to get organized and plan and refine this PAP. So the minor season, there's also a minor season in Eastern Kenya from February to March with harvest from July and August. The problem is that the rains are reliable, so it's not clear how much planting there will be. And since basically we've missed the main season in 2020, we either need to target the minor season 2021 or wait a year and start during the major season of 2021 next August. But we can do some background work and recruitment of agro dealers to get ready so that we're ready to go to the field this year. So we're in a bit of a waiting game, but like I said, it gives us time to plan, and we appreciate any suggestions or feedback you have on this initial PAP that I've presented. So thank you for your time. And hopefully, I don't think that was too long, so we should have time for questions about all of these presentations.
Great, thanks, Jake. Yes, you brought us in under time. Nick, yeah, I don't know how best we should do questions. I guess there's 24 of us. I don't think there'll be a clamoring for microphone space. So if we just want to do an open session for 14 minutes of questions, unmute yourself and ask away for any of the authors or any of the presenters.
Hey, Jake. This is Nick.
Oh, hi, how are you?
Hey, good, thanks. Are you guys going to stratify your randomization?
Yeah, so we've talked about that. Yeah, I think if we can, get some, at least demographic information at baseline before we, select who randomly gets treated in year 1, I think it would make sense.
Yeah, I mean, with the small sample, it could really, really help with balance. And especially, I mean, I don't know if you're going to be able to pick up heterogeneous effects based on grit or whatever, because you're starting to slice the sample pretty thin. But you're definitely, I think you should definitely consider stratifying on those variables that you want to look at impact heterogeneity by.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Well, if there's no clamoring, I have a comment for Jake too.
Okay.
My number one concern with, this is Sarah Jansen, sorry. My number one concern with your paper is with respect to hypothesis 2.
Yep.
So that's the one where you're comparing impacts over time. But I think you need to think really carefully about the counterfactual there, because you no longer have a pure control.
That's true.
So what you'd be comparing, right, is the impact from someone who was treated later, 1-year impacts, to someone who's been treated for 2 years. But, in the case of a shock or something, you can have something like really throw things off in terms of how you interpret those results. So I think you want to be really careful with that hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Right, because yes, the control will then be treated. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any leeway to get around that. Obviously, it'd be ideal if you could either treat that, your control group later and try to collect your second inline beforehand, or get a bigger sample.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And we could also certainly have like a pure control group, because we've committed to training 300. So maybe we could just set up another 150 that are pure control and never trained. And
yeah, I mean, I think that would be ideal for sure if you could do that.
Yeah.
That would make your power so much bigger too.
Yeah.
You should definitely do that.
Yep. And it would still answer the question that, of course, USAID and everybody should care about, is the sustainability of these kind of programs. Was there any, sort of longer term, even if it's only 2 years, continuation for these people? Yeah, that's a good point.
I have a question.
I think go ahead, Yang. I'll make my comments later.
This is Yang Hu from Ohio State. I have a question for Jeffrey and pretty much for everybody here. And Jeff, you're talking about the essentially the EXECON, the AAEA should potentially consider adopting the pre-analysis and registration idea. Have you guys all heard anything, like even rumors about AAEA potentially adopting anything, along these lines in terms of timeline? How many years we'll be talking about in terms of having this kind of plan? That's part one. Part two question is, are this sort of pre-registration idea going to be applied to only field work like RCTs, or pretty much on all survey works? If I do a consumer survey, would I be potentially required or better off to be required to submit a pre-analysis plan? Thank you.
Those are both good questions. I'll start with the second one first. So I've used pre-analysis plans in observational work. In my personal opinion is that developing a basic pre-analysis plan, what Nicole Kaufman calls a hypothesis registry, or like registering a hypothesis. It just lays out, this is the data I'm going to collect. These are how I'm going to measure outcomes, and these are the hypotheses I will test. I found that personally to be very useful in all of the work I do, whether it's experimental or observational. It helps focus the ideas. It helps, narrow your field of vision, and it helps just define what you want to do ahead of time, so that you're not kind of, flailing around and trapped under a mound of data where you don't really know what to do. So I found them useful in all of my work, and I've begun to develop them for each new research project and register them regardless of how I'm collecting whether it's an experiment or an observational study. And I personally think that, that should just it'd be useful, and it is a valuable practice for all economists to hone. Whether they should be required or not, I mean,
thank you.
It'd be pretty unfair of me to impose my personal preferences on everyone else. But I do think that the field in general has incentives or an interest in ensuring that the research that we do is good research, and whether this is a tool that produces good research is, I guess, an empirical question.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to put Nick, you're an associate editor, right?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to put you on the spot and then ask you, has this been discussed at all at the AJAE?
Well, the associate editors weren't involved with the meetings this year. It was just the editors. So I don't know. I don't think so. I've been talking, well, yeah, I don't think so. Basically, all I've heard is that they don't really know yet kind of how they feel about pre-analysis plans.
Well, I'm the editor of the Canadian Journal. I can testify, we have certainly not been bringing this up as a major talk point yet. So I'm curious.
Again, oh, sorry, Jake, go ahead.
No, the only thing I've heard last year was there was going to be a pilot to try to do some replication. I mean, that's a little bit different, but the idea that after you get a paper accepted, you're supposed to submit your code, but then nobody ever makes sure that it, replicates your results. There was going to be a pilot that associated with AJE ran your code to make sure that it was replicable. But I'm not sure that ever went beyond a pilot. But as far as pre-analysis plan, I haven't heard anything either.
Yeah, so again, this is my personal opinion, and I don't want to impose my ideas on everyone else. But I think anytime you go out and collect new data, like you have to design the survey, you have to design the sampling frame. It'd be very easy to write down at that stage, what are the research questions and what do you want to test? And to solve this file drawer problem, post that on OSF or Archive, or there's any number of places that we could be posting these studies in a searchable database. If you're not collecting new data, then it requires more work. But anyone who's collecting new data, this is already part of your thought process. So write it down and make it public.
So Jeff, how do you see the registry information being used? I was thinking about that when I read your paper. So let's say everybody's now compelled to register their study or their RCT on, I don't know, hybrid seed adoption or something. And then would it be so now we know how many studies there have been on that topic. And then maybe in 5 years, somebody could go back and, look at, all these studies, and we could say that, if there's 50 studies, 30 have found positive impacts, 10 have found no impact, and then 10 weren't published or something. And we can, do some meta-analysis. Is that how it would be used?
Yeah, exactly. Just think of hydroxychloroquine debates today. It allows for this meta-analysis of okay, well, here's a bunch of studies that showed no results. Here's a bunch of studies that showed results. I think I've worked on conservation agriculture, and there's a bunch of studies that show it works, and there's a couple studies that show it doesn't work. And the weight of evidence is that conservation agriculture does work, but is that really what's going on, or is it simply that positive results get published and there's a whole host of unpublished studies that show CA doesn't work? They just are buried in a file drawer.
Yep, definitely. So there'd have to be some requirement or some incentive for people to do it. But I think that's a good point.
I think the concern with the requirement, though, is a point that Angus Deaton recently raised, which is that, I think we can talk about the value, like the benefits of registering and fixing this file drawer problem. The problem is if, someone that's really smart like Angus Deaton learns about something through exploratory research that he didn't pre-register. And what if it's a really big, important contribution and now that finding is just not allowed to be published? That seems like a potential cost of that requirement. And the question is, how often does that happen? And even if it doesn't happen very often, or it shouldn't happen very often, but we know it does, that requirement is maybe getting in the way of finding out important things and learning about important things. So I think that's the trade-off, is like, you have these benefits where it fixes the file drawer problem, or like a pre-analysis plan, maybe that fixes the p-hacking problem even more. But you still have to weigh that against this idea that maybe not all hypotheses can be pre-registered.
I personally really appreciate Jeffrey's idea of allowing some level of flexibility in the process. So how often really science is pre-planned science? How often people discover things that they didn't even plan to discover? So I think some level of flexibility really, I think, is in order here. I agree.
Sarah, do you want to basically follow up on your comments with the Pact raft idea? I mean, that's kind of getting at this idea of, is there a way that we can provide flexibility while also registering these hypotheses?
Sure, yeah. When Jeff and I were writing the paper, it felt like there were two approaches. One is what we call Ulysses Pact, right? Very firm and inflexible. One, what we call Ulysses Raft, which is super exploratory in the way maybe research was more traditionally done. And I felt like it was really important to point out that maybe there is a middle ground, because I do think there are a lot of benefits to writing a pre-analysis plan. I think it's really helpful when you're working with teams. I think it's really helpful, for me at least, to think through all the details before someone actually digs into the data and starts running regressions. And so just practically speaking, I found it to be a really painful but really useful exercise. But I also think, in my experience, it's really, really hard to get it right the first time. And so having that flexibility, to me, is really, really important. So I think having like a guide to your research that isn't like, a pact is really important, because it allows all these benefits of thinking through it in advance, but also the flexibility to be, exploratory, or to deviate if you realize that you made a mistake, or there's a better approach, or some new method came out. Like, you shouldn't be tied to doing it the wrong way if you realize in retrospect that there's a better avenue. And that's what I think we're proposing in that paper.
So we are at half past, which is the end of the session. I don't know if we get kicked off by AAEA or what happens, but are there any other questions?
Jeff, do you and Sarah want to talk more about the, since we read each other's things, or do you want to just email? Whatever, I don't know what you all are schedule is like.
Yeah, so I made a bunch of notes, and I'm happy if the three of us can sit down virtually and we can talk. It might be easier than trying to type. It'll probably be quicker than me typing up my notes.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's great. Let's let everyone go, and then let's talk offline about when is a good time to provide some feedback. So I'll just say thanks to everyone for being here. And if you have any comments for any of us, certainly we'd welcome your feedback.
Yep. Thank you all for attending. I am very happy to see 25 people on the call. It's great turnout. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day, people. Cheers.
Thanks.